is Megan Hill. I'm the director of the Honoring Nations program at the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development, which is housed at the Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation at the Kennedy School. And today I'm speaking with my boss and mentor, Professor Joseph Kalt. Joe, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm the Ford Foundation Professor Emeritus of International Political Economy at the Kennedy School. And since 1987, I've been the co-director and founder of the Harvard Project on American Indian Economic Development.
Great. So like countries around the world and cities and states in the US, tribal nations throughout Indian country are working incredibly hard to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and care for their citizens. And so beyond the immediate public health needs, they're really grappling with the economic impacts of the virus, which I know you, Joe, have characterized as an immediate threat to Indian country.
Right.
And in response, you, Miriam Jorgensen, Randall Akee, and Eric Henson recently sent a letter to Secretary Mnuchin at the US Treasury outlining the challenges faced by tribal nations and also offered some recommendations about the disbursement of the COVID-19 response funds. So I wonder if we can talk a little bit about that, and maybe a good place to start is to have you share an overview of the unique financial challenges that Indian country is facing as a result of the COVID-19 crisis.
Sure, and you're right, the crisis is having a tremendously negative impact on Indian country. Indian country is the legal phrase that describes the 574 federally recognized Indian tribes in the United States. What people need to understand, I think, about the impact is that first, since the mid-1970s approximately, we've been in an era of federal policies, what are technically known as self-determination through self-governance. Mm-hmm. And today, Indian tribes across the United States have the same powers and responsibilities as any state or local government has to meet the needs of its tribal citizens. So tribes do everything from pave roads, run health departments, wildlife management, trash collection, everything you can think of that we expect state and local government to do. Mm-hmm. Unlike state and local governments, however, tribes lack the kind of traditional tax bases of property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes. Tribes instead have depended tremendously upon their business enterprises. These are often gaming, casino operations that the public is pretty familiar with. Those casino operations are owned by the tribal government in just the way, for example, the state of Massachusetts owns a gaming business called the lottery. Well, tribes have the same powers and responsibilities. Less than half of tribes, however, own casinos, only about 245 of the 574. So all tribes are dependent on enterprise revenues, business revenues, but many times it's not even casino revenues. Well, the COVID-19 crisis has caused an abrupt shutdown of most of the tribal enterprises. We're not aware of a single tribal casino, for example, that is open anywhere in the United States. And most tribes have issued their own ordinances and orders requiring shelter at home, social distancing, and so forth. So tribes have seen their revenues just cut to zero abruptly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because when tribal businesses are closed, there's no revenue for the government to function. And so in particular, when these enterprises are closed, like the gaming industry and others, can you talk about the impact sort of on the ground in terms of revenue and jobs and services?
Sure. There is a modest amount of revenue that still comes from the federal government. The U.S. Civil Rights Commission about a year and a half ago studied that and found it was extremely meager. So the vast bulk of tribal governmental public services and functions are being funded by tribal enterprises, both gaming and non-gaming. The impact that you ask about, the impact is the cutting off of those revenues to tribal government is like cutting off a city or a county's tax revenues. And the result of it is we're seeing massive furloughs and layoffs of workers, the cutting of contributions by tribes to their employees, pension funds, insurance, and so forth. And In addition, massive spillover effects to the regions and states in which tribes' economies are embedded. In our work, we find that in many cases, tribes have become the economic engine, particularly in rural America, where economies aren't terribly strong generally. Tribes have often become the economic engine. And so when this COVID-19 crisis is hitting, it's not only affecting tribes, their ability to deliver public services to their citizens, but it's also spilling over immediately off reservation into the broader state in which tribes find themselves.
So Joe, yeah, I think that's a critical point, particularly the spillover effect on regional economies. In particular, the letter that you all wrote to Secretary Mnuchin talks about the potential job losses among Indians and non-Indians alike. And so I wonder if you could speak to sort of specifically the impact on non-natives.
Sure. I think people don't realize that even within sort of the reservation, as you think of it, tribal government, tribal enterprises, gaming and non-gaming, more than half of all the employees of tribes and their enterprises are non-Indian. This reflects a good thing, actually. The economic development that's been taking place in Indian country means that tribes now have the wherewithal to grow. And in many cases, they're having to reach out to communities beyond their own and hiring people. And so there's a large number of jobs directly for tribes and their enterprises that are held by non-Indians. In addition, I mentioned these spillover effects that tribal economies spill over into the regions around them. Well, most of that spillover, the spending that a tribal employee, Indian or non-Indian, does in the next town shows up as money for that town, employment in that town, and most of those workers are non-Indian. We estimate that, based on some preliminary modeling, we estimate that the tribal enterprises and plus tribal government operations in the aggregate account for the employment of about 1.1 million people. And somewhat over 900,000 of those workers are non-Indians. So the vast majority, it turns out, once you account for, particularly for the spillover effects, turn out to be non-Indians. When you choke off, the coronavirus chokes off these tribal revenues, you're choking off wages, benefits, and employment for lots of people, both Indian and non-Indian.
Yeah, that's really staggering. So given the situation, what specific action should the federal government be doing? And really, how should they be partnering with Indian country to help with what is and what will be a devastating financial impact from COVID-19?
Well, I think that what the federal government needs to be focused on, as it is doing, is on supporting tribes in their roles as local governments. In other words, tribes, as I've said, have the rights, responsibilities, and powers that are very akin to other state and local governments in the United States. The current CARES Act sets aside about $8 billion for tribes, tribal governments. And the key thing there is that those monies be allocated in a way that reflects the size of tribes and their economic impact, both on their own reservations, but more broadly in their regions. The second thing that the federal government needs to take into account, and this is what I'm about to say reflects decades of research by the Harvard Project, we keep finding that this policy of self-determination through self-governance actually is working. It's, for the first time in more than a century, allowing economic development to take hold and so forth. The reason it's working is because local decision makers, tribes, have been in charge of how the money is spent, whether they put money into a dental clinic or a new housing project or whatever it might be. Well, with this $8 billion of CARES Act funds, it'll be important that the federal government not tie tight strings around the decisions tribes make as to how to allocate those funds. By the way, state and local governments are telling the federal government the same thing. State and local governments want the freedom to figure out what the priorities are depending on their local conditions. And so tribes are very much like state and local governments and need to be treated in the same way.
Thank you. I think that's a great place to end, unless you have any final thoughts, Joe?
No, I would just reiterate that people need to understand how important these tribal economies are and how important it is to sustain the ability of these local tribal governments, just as it is with other state and local governments, sustain their ability to meet the needs of their people.
Great. Well, thank you, Joe. I appreciate your time. To learn more about the work of the Harvard Project, please check us out online at www.hpaied.org, where you can find our research and also explore our nation-building toolboxes, including our most recent, which provides resources to tribal nation and leaders as they serve their citizens through the COVID-19 crisis. So thank you.